Good afternoon. I'm David Muir. We're coming on the air at this hour because there is breaking news in Bill Cosby's sexual assault retrial. There has been a verdict. The comedian, now 80, has been found guilty on all counts. He'd been accused of drugging and assaulting a woman at his Philadelphia home. Again, guilty, all counts. Moments ago, that panel of 7 men and 5 women, after deliberating for 14 hours, came back with the verdict. They'd come back with 3 questions in the last 24 hours, but no questions today. I want to bring in our legal analyst, Sonny Hostin, who's watching this with me. Guilty on all 3 counts. This is a significant development. He faces prison time, significant prison time.
He really does. I mean, I think the issue here was always one of consent, whether or not Andrea Constant consented to sexual relationships with Bill Cosby. And I think, you know, what was the game changer here was the other women allowed to testify. And so the prosecution here then was able to prove this was a pattern for Bill Cosby. He drugged women. He then assaulted women without their consent, because clearly you can't consent if you are under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And so that, I think, was the difference in this case as opposed to the former trial where we know that the jury deadlocked on whether or not to convict Bill Cosby.
So for those of our viewers who are just joining us now, you're watching live coverage. Bill Cosby's retrial. He's just been found guilty on all counts. He'd been charged with 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. We do know that this conviction could put him in prison for up to 10 years on each count. Our team inside the courtroom reporting that there was no reaction from Bill Cosby. He looked straight ahead as this verdict was delivered, though there were audible gasps in the courtroom. Andrea Constant nodding her head when she heard the verdict. As we know, this is the second time that she has faced Bill Cosby down in court. And Sonny, as you pointed out, the major difference this time is that they were able to actually hear from other women that might have bolstered this case. Absolutely,
absolutely. And I think that's something that Bill Cosby's attorneys certainly fought against. His prior attorneys more successful. And I will say, when you're a prosecutor, as I was, and you want to prove that this is the behavior of someone, it certainly is much more powerful if you have more than one voice. I mean, we're in the time of the Me Too movement, and I'm sure certainly there is a heightened awareness of sexual assault and the question of consent. So if you're a prosecutor, you not only have Andrea's voice, now you have 1, 2, 3, I believe there were 5 women that testified that this was his pattern, this was his practice. It is very difficult, in my view, for a jury to look away under those circumstances. That would be overwhelming evidence of a pattern or practice of sexual assault.
You bring up the moment that this country is in, the Me Too movement, bringing much needed attention to women in the workplace and women who have accused people of high profile before. That would include Bill Cosby. And it was interesting, his own defense team pointed to the Me Too movement, hoping to make the case that this would be, as you would say, a mob mentality in the effort to retry him. We do know that from the courtroom, 3 accusers burst into tears after they heard the verdict. We're now getting reports that Bill Cosby, who sat there, listened to the verdict, looking straight ahead, has now put his head down, his eyes closed, taking deep breaths. We mentioned that Andrea Constant nodded her head in approval when she heard the verdict that she certainly was hoping for. Again, as you're watching right now, Bill Cosby found guilty on all 3 counts in this retrial. He faces up to 10 years for each of those counts. And quickly, before we say goodbye on this, Sonny, he faces 10 years in prison for each count. What are we likely to see, though? You know, he's an 80-year-old man. Any sentence at this point of 10 years is a death sentence, in my view. The judge will look at the case. The judge will look at his stature in the community. The judge will listen to victim impact statements. It's very possible that the judge has wide discretion here. So we're looking at any amount of time. It could be no time in prison, or it could be up to 30 years. If the judge decides this is something that needs to send a message to women in our community, that enough is enough, that you can't do this and get away with it, he could very well spend the rest of his life in prison. How likely is it, though, that he wouldn't face any prison time if that's an option that you just pointed out?
I have to say, I think that's very unlikely. Again, given the severity of the convictions here, of the verdict, and of his actions, and the moment that we're in terms of accountability for men and aggression towards women, I would be very surprised if he did not serve any time in prison.
And we did see Bill Cosby's wife late in this retrial appearing at the courthouse.
Yes, she certainly has stood by her husband. She has been very supportive of him. I doubt at this point that Bill Cosby will walk away, even today, a free man. My guess is that the prosecution will ask for his bail to be revoked.
Almost immediately.
Almost immediately, and I think he'll spend tonight in prison.
All right, Sonny, stick with us here because we do want to get to ABC's Lindsay Davis, who's been covering this trial from the very start. She joins us from outside the courthouse. And Lindsay, I know you were inside the courtroom. Initial descriptions of Bill Cosby looking straight ahead as that verdict was delivered, then putting his head down, taking deep breaths as it was described to us.
David, I, at a certain point, couldn't even find where he was in the courtroom, and I had been looking right at his face. When the first guilty came through, he just kind of dropped his head, and then he must have dropped himself so low that you couldn't even see it above the desk where he was sitting. He just disappeared, and so I couldn't give you any kind of reaction other than what might be described as, you know, someone who's sitting and kind of partially collapses forward. In the room, there were audible gasps. There were 4 survivors, or 4, they call themselves the Survivor Sisters, 4 Cosby accusers, 3 of them who've been here every single day for this trial that lasted for 12 days, plus these 2 days of deliberations. And then last year, in June, they were here as well, day in and day out, for that trial. They had to be escorted out of the courtroom because they sobbed so loudly, and they asked to be able to stay. They said they were going to stop crying, but they had to leave. They were overcome, 3 of them that were escorted out, 1 was able to stay, but just overcome with so much emotion that many of these accusers, going back to the 1980s, saying, and in some cases beyond that, but saying that they had been drugged and sexually assaulted by Bill Cosby.
Lindsay, as you know, we had every expectation that prosecutors would ask almost immediately that bail be revoked. Any word on that?
We've heard that they will ask, but it's not clear, and it's up to the judge to decide. I mean, of course, he's going to take into consideration, here's a man that in 2 months he's going to be 81 years old. He's legally blind, and so how much of a threat to society is he? And certainly, these are arguments that are going to be made by Tom Mesereau, his lead defense attorney. So it will be up to the judge. We're told that sentencing would take place from 60 to 90 days from now.
As you mentioned, his defense team there, they had made the argument that I mentioned with Sonny a moment ago, that this Me Too movement, that Bill Cosby and this retrial had been swept up in that this was a sort of mob mentality. But Lindsay, as you were in the courtroom studying those 7 men, those 5 women who made up this jury, as they walked back into the courtroom to deliver this verdict, clearly they did not buy that argument.
You couldn't tell by their faces, and I was looking to see if there was going to be any indication as far as which way this was going to go. And that's why I think there was so much just suspense inside the courtroom, because it really could have gone either way. It just wasn't clear. This jury was asking some of the same exact questions that last year's jury was asking as far as what's the legal definition of consent. We just had no idea. But what I will say, the two large factors here, difference between last trial and this trial. Of course, as you mentioned, we're now in the Me Too movement era, but also that you heard from those 5 additional accusers this go round. Whether or not you believed Andrea Constand, you had those 5 other women saying, yes, it happened to me too, with very similar descriptions. In many cases, they use the same words to describe how they felt after they say that they had been drugged, and how they say that they had been sexually assaulted. So while the district attorney back in 2005, Bruce Castor, had said initially that he hadn't charged Bill Cosby because he said that Andrea Constand had ruined her own credibility and would not be believed by a jury, here you have, he's proven wrong today and guilty on all 3 counts.
And Lindsay, with just a few moments left, was Camille Cosby in the courtroom, his wife?
Camille Cosby was not in the courtroom as she did during the last trial. She only appeared on the day of the defense's closing argument.
All right, Lindsay Davis, who's been covering this case and the previous trial, our thanks to you. Our thanks to Sonny Hostin here watching this with me. Again, Bill Cosby found guilty on all counts in that retrial just moments ago. He does face the real possibility of living out the rest of his life in prison, and we still await word on whether or not prosecutors will ask to revoke bail, though that is expected and very soon. We'll have much more coming up later today on ABC's World News Tonight. Until then, I'm David Buer here in New York. Good day.
This has been a special report.